They used force. They used force.
We use force for all sorts of things in terms of public health.
We don't generally use force to invade people's bodies.
Do you think that
corrupt with a tinge of malevolence, willing to extract money out of people by putting their health on the line. You don't believe that?
Do you think that we get effective drugs from pharmaceutical companies?
Not particularly. I don't bloody well know what they're
That's what you're implying now.
Well, look, if you're going to use Occam's razor, you're kind of stuck in an awkward place here.
You have to trust third parties to some extent. When you go outside...
I don't have to trust...
Of course you do. You do every day. When you turn the keys in your car, you hope your engine doesn't explode. When you're drinking water, you hope that the public water or whatever tap or bottled water you got it out of isn't contaminated or poisoned with cholera.
I don't do that as a consequence of consensus.
No, you of course you do.
No, I don't. I do that as a consequence of observing multiple times that when I put the goddamn key in the ignition, the truck started.
I heard, so we can pretend now that the conservative argument was just compulsory vaccines are bad because they infringe on my freedom. That wasn't the conservative argument. The conservative argument was that mass deaths were going to happen, mass side effects were going to happen. There was going to be all this corruption and stuff related to vaccine distribution, to the crazier theories were microchips and blah, blah, blah. None of that came true. Absolutely none of the conservative fear-mongering related to the mRNA vaccines came to fruition. But now that's all forgotten. And that was used
What do you mean
as
none of it? What do you make of the excess deaths?
For related to vaccines, there are almost none. The mRNA vaccines have been administered related to vaccines.
We don't know. No.
We absolutely know. We absolutely. This is like settled science.
What do we know?
In terms of vaccine-related deaths?
No, that's not my question. Excess deaths in Europe are up about 20%, and they have been since the end of the COVID pandemic.
Sounds really high to me. 20%?
Go look.
I'll check afterwards, but is this including like the Ukrainian war with Russia?
No, it's not including the Ukrainian war.
Okay.
No.
Are you implying that you think it's because of vaccines?
I'm not implying anything. I'm saying what the excess deaths are.
But what is your take on what's causing it? Well, you said that in a counter to me describing mRNA vaccines. You said, well, the excess deaths are 20%. That makes it seem that the implication is that the vaccines are causing it or leading to it?
First of all, something is causing it.
Well, that obviously, yeah.
Something is causing it, or some combination of factors.
Sure.
Now, one possibility is that the healthcare systems were so disrupted by our insane focus on the COVID epidemic that we're still mopping up as a consequence of that.
Wait, are these excess deaths tracing back through COVID as well?
Post-COVID.
Just post-COVID.
Post-COVID.
Okay.
Right. They're terrifying. Right. They're terrifying. And they're not well publicized. And
I think excess trusts are, the fact that you're speaking to them right now seems like...
Yeah, but I ferret down a lot of rabbit holes. It's not like it's front bloody page news on the New York Times.
Sure, but I think excess deaths, that's a metric that you can Google, and I'm pretty sure there are like 3 different huge organizations that track excess deaths around the world.
There are many more than 3, yes, sure. In every single European country. Right. Okay. Well, so one relatively straightforward hypothesis is that it's a consequence of the disruption of the healthcare system, the staving off of cancer treatment, etc., the increase in depression, anxiety, suicidality, and alcoholism that was a consequence of the lockdowns, the economic disruption. And there's plenty of reason to believe that some of that is the case. But the other obviously glaring possibility is that injecting billions of people with a vaccine that was not tested by any stretch of the imagination with the thoroughness that it should have before it was forced upon people also might be a contributing factor, partly because we know that it led to a rise in myocarditis among young men. And we also know that there was absolutely no reason whatsoever to ever recommend that that vaccine was delivered to young children. Whose risk of death at COVID was so close to 0 that it might as well have been 0.
When you're talking about a disease, the risk of death isn't the only thing that you worry about for the disease. Also,
so you're going to talk about transmission? Because that was another thing that the COVID vaccine pushed. Yeah, but it didn't do anything to transmission.
It absolutely did, because it decreased your chance of getting affected. It didn't destroy. It didn't get rid of transmission, but it reduced transmission.
Yeah, but it was claimed that it would get rid of transmission.
Only if you take one reading of one single quote. I think that Biden said one time where he said, "No, come on." I've heard so many times because everybody say, "Oh, you can't take anything Trump says seriously." Biden one time on the news says, if you get the vaccine, you won't transfer the disease.
That is so silly.
Which was no.
Do you know that our Prime Minister in Canada deprived Canadians of the right to travel for 6 months because the unvaccinated were going to transmit COVID with more likelihood than the vaccinated? So this wasn't one bloody statement. This was
hold on.
thorough government policy
What
in
I'm
my
saying
country.
is there wasn't a statement given that if you get vaccinated, there is a 0% chance of transmitting the disease. The idea is that vaccines were supposed to help because
Fine,
it reduces your hospitalization, it reduces death, and it reduces transmission, hopefully by making it so that people don't get sick or don't get sick for as long. All three of those things the vaccines did exceedingly well. They continue to do that to this day, but especially for the first variant and then the Delta variant, the vaccines helped immensely here. They were tested. The myocarditis rates are like 7 out of 100,000 injections, and the myocarditis is generally acute, and it's generally not as bad as even getting the coronavirus itself, which will lead you also
it's
to
a
having
much
myocarditis.
worse side effect than side effects that have caused other vaccines to be taken off the market before.
That a 7 out of 100,000 rate of acute myocarditis or pericarditis is not a worse side effect than any other vaccine. I think that is a completely acceptable, given that the disease itself is more likely to cause myocarditis or pericarditis.
Yes, I don't think the data support that presupposition anymore. The latest peer-reviewed studies show that that's simply not true, especially among young men.
So there is an age bracket of young men where the elevated rate of myocarditis, acute myocarditis from the vaccine might have been higher, but we're talking about like 3 or 4 cases per 100,000 people. And again, myocarditis, pericarditis are generally acute conditions. They don't last for very long.
I told you at the beginning of this conversation that the progressive leftists were on the side of the pharmaceutical companies.
It's not about being on the side of the pharmaceutical companies. It's about
really,
yeah.
Yeah, well, what I see as the unholy part of that alliance with the pharmaceutical companies is that it dovetails with the radical utopians' willingness to use power to impose their utopian vision.
Well, then what do you make of the
otherwise,
fact
how
that-
would you explain it? Because the leftists should have been the ones that were most skeptical about the bloody pharmaceutical companies. And they jumped on the vaccine bandwagon in exactly the same way that you're doing right now.
Pharmaceutical companies have helped us tremendously throughout the...
Right, there we go. Fine. No,
you think modern medicine
think
hasn't?
so. No, I don't think so.
You're just wrong.
I think they're
You're
utterly
completely wrong.
I see. So you don't think that the pharmaceutical companies who dominate the advertising landscape with 75% of the funding are corrupt?
I don't. Corrupt is a very broad.
No. It's.
Do you think that
corrupt with a tinge of malevolence?
Do you think
willing to extract money out of people by putting their health on the line? You don't believe that?
Do you think that we get effective drugs from pharmaceutical companies?
Not particularly.
Okay. Do you think that any vaccines work?
Yes.
Do you think that any?
I don't think 80 of them work at once for babies. I think that's a little risky.
But yet we've been on this vaccine schedule for how many decades?
Like
and babies don't.
Like this. Not like this. Not carefully.
I had a ton of vaccines when I was a child. I'm pretty sure that was the norm for people. There were a ton of vaccines you had to take.
There's way more now.
Okay. And you think
and you can understand why. I mean, look, part of it, no doubt, part of it is a consequence of the genuine willingness to protect children. But the moral hazard is quite clear, and people on the left used to be aware of this.
What do you make of the fact? What do you think the mRNA vaccine, the speeding up of it, came from? How do you make for the fact that it was Donald Trump that did warp speed?
Terror. Foolish panicking, just like we're doing with the climate issue.
So you think Trump was
panicking?
Was he in bed with the pharmaceuticals? Was he working with the left, or was it just that was the only panicky thing he made? He didn't try to push for the mass lockdowns like other far left people would have wanted him to do. That was just the one mistake he made, was the pushing for the vaccine?
No, I think Trump undoubtedly made all sorts of mistakes, and it certainly wasn't only the left that stampeded toward the forced COVID vaccine debacle. But it was most surprising to me that it emerged on the left, because the left at least had been protected against the depredations of gigantic predatory corporations by their skepticism of the gigantic enterprises that can engage in regulatory capture, and that just vanished.
Is it not possible that maybe people looked and they said, hey, if all the governments, all the institutions, all the schools, all the private companies across all the countries around the world are saying the same thing, maybe it is the case that this vaccine just helps. Is that not possible?
Oh, sure. Of course it's possible, but that didn't mean it was right.
Well,
they used force. They used force.
We use force for all sorts of things in terms of public health.
We don't generally use force to invade people's bodies.
How long have vaccine mandates been a thing in Canada, the United States, and the entire world?
I don't think they should have been a thing.
That's great if you don't think they should have been, but when you say we don't generally use force, we absolutely use force. We've enforced vaccines for a long time. It's an important part of public health.
Fair enough. we did it on a scale and at a rate during the COVID pandemic, so-called pandemic, that was unparalleled. And the consequence of that was that we injected billions of people with an experimental, and it wasn't a bloody vaccine.
Of course
It wasn't.
Yes, it was.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It's
Well,
not.
because it have a 100% success rate? You think it's a definition of vaccine? The whole point of the vaccine is to give your body a protein
It's
to train
not
on
the
so that your
same
immune system works in the
technology.
future. Who cares if it's not the same? There's
They
different
used
types
the word
of...
vaccine so that they didn't have to contend with the fact that it wasn't the same technology.
There are different types of vaccines
There certainly
that are
and
different technologies.
Fine.
The mRNA vaccines is a type
This
of
used
vaccine
to be
technology.
vaccines. Now this is vaccines.
No, it was like this and now it's like this.
No. It was like this and now it's like this. The mRNA technology was a radical qualitative leap forward in technology. You can call it a vaccine if you want to, but it bears very little resemblance to any vaccine that went before that. And the reason it was called a vaccine was because vaccine was a brand name that had a track record of safety, and shoehorning it in that was one of the ways to make sure that people weren't terrified of the technology. And
I
you
think
know,
the reason
I
it's called a vaccine
understand
is because they're injecting you with something that's inoculating you against something in the future because it has proteins that resemble a virus that infects
there
your
are
immune system to
overlaps
train against.
between the mRNA technologies and vaccines, to be sure, but they wouldn't have been put forward with the rate that they were put forward if they weren't a radical new technology. And it's bad in principle to inject billions of people with an untested new technology.
Isn't it also bad in principle for billions of people to get infected with a worldwide pandemic that initially was causing a decent number of deaths, a ton of complications, shutting down world economies?
Maybe it was.
So shouldn't we be able to engage in that analysis and figure out, like, if we look at the
We're
side
not
effects of the
engaging
vaccine?
in the analysis.
No, because now
We're
we're talking about whether or not
pretending nothing
vaccines are even
happened.
vaccines or not instead.
No, don't play that game. That is not what I was doing. I was making a very specific and careful case. The mRNA technology, by wide recognition, is an extraordinarily novel technology. And
That doesn't make it not a vaccine, though.
Well, okay, it's a radically transformed form of vaccine. I don't give a
make
damn.
updates,
That still makes it something so new that the potential danger of its mass administration was highly probable to be at least or more dangerous than the thing that it was supposed to protect against. And we are seeing that in the excess
We are
deaths.
absolutely not saying. So are you implying none of the
Yeah,
excess deaths
right.
were caused by the vaccines? Or
I
it sounds like
don't bloody well know what they're
that's what you're
caused by.
implying now.
Well, look, if you're going to use Occam's razor, you're kind of stuck in an awkward place here.
I'm
Because you
absolutely not sucking on it. This is
Yes.
the most administered vaccine in or inoculation, or whatever you prefer to call it, in the history of all of mankind. Every single organization around the world is motivated to call this out if it was a bad thing. You don't think Russia or China would be screaming if Donald Trump or the United States warp sped through a vaccine that was having deleterious effects on populations all around the world? You don't think there wouldn't be some academic institution? You didn't think there'd be more than a handful of doctors and Joe Rogan and some conservatives saying this vaccine might have been bad if it was the case that American companies working with companies in Europe and Germany especially, why? Because that's where BioNTech is from, in order to create or manufacture a vaccine that was causing excess deaths all around the world. There are so many different people that would be motivated to call this out. How do you explain
They
the
are
fact that
calling it out.
No, it's a handful of people. Where are the governments
Look,
calling it out? Where are
it's
the
always
academic institutions calling it out? Where are the other private companies calling it out? Wouldn't you stand to make a killing if you were a private company in Europe and you could say, look, the mRNA vaccines for sure are causing all of these issues. Why wouldn't Putin? Why wouldn't Xi Jinping? Why wouldn't anybody else in the world call this out if it was as horrible as it was?
There are plenty of people attempting to call
Nobody
out that.
credible and no huge institution.
What do you make of the excess deaths? You haven't come up with a bloody hypothesis.
I don't even know if there are 20% at the excess deaths in Europe right now. If I had to guess off the top of my head, it's going to be, like you said, one might be lingering effects of an overwhelmed healthcare system. Another one might be deaths related to the war in Ukraine. Another one might be rising energy costs that have
But it's
happened for a couple of
absolutely
reasons.
impossible that any of it could be unintended consequences of a novel technology injected into billions of people.
I think that if excess, first of all, there aren't billions of people in Europe. So if there were
didn't say
excess
there
deaths,
were.
I understand, but you're talking about excess deaths in Europe. I'm not aware of excess deaths that exist in other places that are completely and totally unaccounted for, where the only explanation could be the vaccine. I think if there were, I think more people would be talking about it.
Well, first of all, the number of people talking about something is not an indication of the scientific validity of a claim.
I
Quite the
agree with that,
contrary.
but for a
Well, then
vaccine
why
that
are
was-
you using mass consensus as the determinant of what constitutes
Because
truth?
I think for
That's
something,
never been the case.
Because I think for something that was given to billions and billions of people, if this was something that was having a measurable effect on people, it would be impossible to cover it up or ignore it.
Well,
We
what do
wouldn't
you-
have to look at the one case
right.
brought up on a documentary. We wouldn't have to look at the one thing being talked about.
Then what do you
know,
make
but-
of the VAERS data? There's more negative side effects reported from the mRNA vaccines than there were reported for every single vaccine ever created since the dawn of time, and not by a small margin. So it's not just the excess deaths.
I agree.
It's the VAERS data.
What is VAERS data?
It's the database that until the COVID-19 pandemic emerged and we had the unfortunate consequence that there were so many side effects being reported, it was the gold standard for determining whether or not vaccines were safe. And now as soon as it started to misbehave on the mRNA vaccine front, we decided that we were going to doubt the validity of the VAERS reporting system.
Okay, the VAERS reporting system never been the gold standard for anything. VAERS reporting is just if you want to report that there is some issue that you have after getting a vaccine. That's it. I think it's vaccine adverse.
What the hell do you think it was set up for?
To report adverse events that happen after a vaccine.
Why?
To track and see if something was related to the vaccine.
Right.
So
Why?
most people didn't even know VAERS existed until after the COVID vaccine. Once people know that it exists, of course, more people are going to engage with it. But what happens
So
when
it's
you
all
submit a
noise.
report? No, it could be or it couldn't be. So what do? When a bunch of stuff
Well, you first of all might begin by suggesting that maybe it's not all noise.
Correct. So when
Especially
all
given
of
the
these
excess
things are
deaths.
admitted to VAERS, what they do is from there, they investigate. All you can do, all VAERS is I might go and get a vaccine and maybe in 3 days ago, I got a headache. I'm going to go ahead and call my doctor and make this report. And they'll say, okay, well, it's an adverse event after vaccine. It doesn't mean the vaccine caused the headache. And now that more people know about this system than ever.
I'm saying that
just saying that VAERS is not the gold standard of determining if a vaccine is working or not.
What?
Compared to actual longitudinal, perspective, randomized controlled trial
You
studies.
mean like the ones they should have done to the goddamn vaccines?
Like the ones that they did do for the vaccines and they continue to do to this day. Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Yes,
You really
correct.
think that you're in a position to evaluate the scientific credibility of the trials for the vaccines, do you?
No,
Really?
I don't. So I have to trust.
Then what are you
I
doing?
have to do,
I don't trust them. I looked at the bloody data.
First of all, you have to trust third parties to some extent. When you go outside,
I don't have to trust
Of course you do. You do every day. When you turn the keys in your car, you hope your engine doesn't explode. When you're drinking water, you hope that the public water or whatever tap or bottled water you got it out of isn't contaminated or poisoned with cholera.
I don't
when
do
you
that as a consequence of consensus.
No, you of course you do.
No, I don't. I do that as a consequence of observing multiple times that when I put the goddamn key in the ignition, the truck started.
Why do you know it's going to start the 50th or the 100th time? How many times do you
play
wear
Hume
those?
with me.
I'm
You know
not
perfectly
playing
well
Hume.
why.
You don't know if the denim in those jeans isn't leaking into your bloodstream. To some extent, we have to trust third-party institutions to make
Except when they
determination.
use force. How about that?
Especially when they use force. We trust the police officers. We trust the
We
judicial
do.
systems.
We on the left trust the police, do we?
To some extent, do we? If somebody's breaking
That's
into your
why we
house, who do you
defund
call?
them.
I'm not a defunder, but if somebody's breaking into your house, you can be the most defund person in the world. Who are you going to call? Are you going to call your neighbor? Are you going to call Joe Biden? Are you going to call Obama? Are you going to call the Black Panthers? You're going to call the cops.
Okay, so tell me this. Tell me this then, because the core issue here is use of force as far as I'm concerned. You know, we examined some of the weeds around that. Politicians throughout the world, and this would be true on the conservative side now, in the aftermath of the COVID tyranny, because it was more a tyranny than a pandemic,
Okay.
are now saying that we actually didn't force anybody to take the vaccine. So what do you think of that claim? So let's define force.
I think it's
Because in
technically
Canada-
true, but I think it's silly.
What do you mean it's technically true? Define
Technically
force,
true,
then.
and that in the United States, at least, I think the idea, what they tried to do, they weren't able to do it because the Supreme Court shut it down, was Biden tried to make it so that OSHA, who's the body that regulates job safety, could make it so that employees had to get vaccinated. Now, eventually,
what?
that it was,
Or what?
or they'd lose their job.
Okay, does that qualify as force?
That's why I said technically.
Yeah, I know,
not,
but it's a serious question. I mean, because we need to define what constitutes force before we can. It seems to me.
You could argue it's a type of force, sure. I mean, I think it'd be silly to say it's nothing. It is a type of force. It's the same as a cop telling you have to do this, you're going to be killed. No, but it's on the
Right.
spectrum, sure, of course, yeah.
It's as much force as the mRNA vaccines are vaccines.
Sure. It is a type of force, and the mRNA vaccines are a type of vaccine, so sure.
Look,
there we go.
I really think the problem was with the COVID response. I really think the problem was the use of force. I mean, I can understand to some degree, although I'm very skeptical of the pharmaceutical companies and far more skeptical than your insistence upon the utility of consensus might lead me to believe you're skeptical of them, which is surprising, I would say, given
I'm
that
very
the
skeptical of them. That's why I'm glad there's multiple companies, multiple countries, multiple academic institutes that do research, and the FDA. Yeah, I'm very skeptical. You should be in any private system. You should be skeptical of every private company, of course, whether we're talking media, pharmaceuticals, or automobile manufacturers, yeah. But skepticism doesn't mean a blind adherence to the complete total opposite of whatever it is they're saying, right? There undoubtedly, like if you look at Alzheimer's research, there's been groundbreaking improvements on drugs to treat Alzheimer's research over the past 3 years that 5 years ago, none of these drugs even existed. And now, so I mean,
how about if you're skeptical of anyone who's willing to use force to put their doctrine forward?
Then you're skeptical of literally every single person, political ideology ever have existed in all of humankind. Some degree of force, I undoubtedly believe this, right? Some degree of force is probably necessary for any kind of cohesive society, right?
No, I don't believe that.
Of course there is.
No,
even if you had a tribe of
100,
120 people, if somebody was stealing something, right? You have to punish that person.
I said earlier that becomes complicated when you're dealing with the psychopathic types. Right, so that's a complication. But I would say, generally speaking, that the necessity to use force is a sign of bad policy. And no, I don't think, I'm not particularly a Hobbesian. I don't think that the only reason people comport themselves with a certain degree of civility in civilized society is because they're terrified by the fact that the government has a monopoly on force that can be brought against them at any moment. I think that keeps the psychopaths in line to some degree. But I think that most people are enticed into a cooperative relationship, and that formulating the structures that make those relationships possible is a sign of good policy.
I have to ask, because I have watched a lot of your stuff in the past. I remember you speaking very distinctly on this, that for instance, when two men are communicating with each other, there is an underlying threat of force that kind of puts on the guardrails those particular social interactions. For instance,
the threat of force is don't be psychopathic.
How broader is psychopathic here? Are we defining?
Well, I can define it. I mean,
sure, go for it.
Well, a psychopath will gain short-term advantage at the cost of long-term relationship.
Okay,
that's really the core issue. Well, you made a reference to something like that earlier in your discussion when you pointed out that people claim to be motivated, let's say, by principle, but will default to short-term gratification more or less at the drop of a hat. Yeah, exactly. Well, the exaggerated proclivity to do that is at the essence of psychopathy. So it's very immature.
I'm curious, with this definition of psychopathy,
it's the definition of psychopathy. It's not it's not mine. That's the core of psychopathy.
Okay, I'm not in the United States. I think we call it all ASPD now.
No, it's separate from that's antisocial personality disorder.
I thought that subsumed psychopathy and sociopathy.
Psychopathy is more like it's more the pathological core of antisocial personality disorder.
Okay, maybe that might be true. Okay.
That's a better way of thinking. Like the worst, a small number of criminals are responsible for the vast majority of crimes. It's 1% commit 65%, something like that.
Do you think, is psychopathy something that can be environmentally induced, or do you think this is core to a person?
It's both. So for example, if you're disagreeable, like you are, by the way, your proclivity, if you went wrong, would be to go wrong in an antisocial and psychopathic direction. And that's more true of men, for example, than it is for women. That's why men are more likely to be in prison by a lot. I think it's 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 generally. It depends on the particular crime, with it being higher proportion of men as the violence of the crime mounts. So you can imagine on the genetic versus environment side. So imagine that when you're delivered your temperamental hand of cards, you're going to have a certain set of advantages that go along with them that are part and parcel of that genetic determination. And there's going to be a certain set of temptations as well. So for example, if you're high in trait neuroticism, you're going to be quite sensitive to the suffering of others and be able to detect that. That's useful for infant care. But the cost you'll pay is that you'll be more likely to develop depression and anxiety. And if you're disagreeable, extroverted and unconscientious, then the place you'll go if you go badly is in the psychopathic or antisocial direction. And there are environmental determinants of that to some degree.
Sure. Genes express themselves in an environment. I agree. When I'm just curious for the definition of psychopathy, for short-term gain at the expense of long-term
relationship. Really, that's probably the best bit. Yeah.
When you look at stuff like people that are self-destructive, say people that engage in behavioralists like obesity, is that like a type of psychopathy to you, or is that like something different, or how do you define these types of things, I guess, or how do you view that type of thing?
Well, no, there is an overlap in that addictive processes, one of which might lead to obesity, do have this problem of prioritization of the short term. But so that overlaps with the short-term orientation of the psychopath. But a psychopath is See, an obese person isn't gaining anything from your demise to facilitate their obesity, right? So there's a predatory and parasitical element to psychopathy that's not there in other addictive short-term processes.
Do you think, is it possible that there are things, because then to circle back to the tribal example I gave, isn't it possible that people can commit harms against other people where they're not necessarily gaining from their demise, but it's just some other sort of gain that they're doing about it? So for instance, like say like I'm talking to some friends and I'm just gossiping or shit talking another person. I'm not necessarily feeling good that I'm trashing them per se. I'm feeling good because this group of friends might view me more favorably because I have like a gossip or something to share with them.
Well, but that's the gain right there. And you are contributing to the demise of the people that you're gossiping about.
But I think there's like, I feel like there's fundamentally different type of thought process between like, I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because it'll make you like me, versus I want to tell you something juicy about this guy because I hate this guy and I want him to like have a worse reputation among people. I feel like there's different drivers for that.
I would say that's an interesting distinction. I would say probably that the hatred-induced malevolence is a worse form of malevolence than the popularity-inducing malevolence.
Yeah, the only reason
it's a tough one, but
yeah, the only reason I bring that up is because I feel like a lot of malevolence that we have social guardrails for is that type of like selfish malevolence where you're not. I would argue even the majority of malevolence in the world is usually people acting selfishly or being inconsiderate, not necessarily like I hate this.
Yeah,
person,
I think that's right.
Sure,
I think that that's why Dante outlined levels of hell, right? Yeah, well, exactly that. And I mean, that book was an investigation into the structure of malevolence, right? He put betrayal at the bottom, which I think is right. I think that's right, because people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, which almost only accompanies an encounter with malevolence rather than tragic circumstances, they are often betrayed, sometimes by other people, but often by themselves. And yes, there are levels of hell, and you outlined a couple there.
So I guess then my question is just that if you have people, so the kid that steals an orange from a stand, not because he hates the shop owner, but because he wants the orange or he's hungry, without some type of societal, it doesn't have to be the government, it could be family, religious, without some type of use of force, do you think that society ever exists without
use force on your wife?
Well, what are we considering force? Is withholding sex, for instance, is that considered force? Or is, saying we're going to cancel a vacation?
Deprivation of an expected reward is a punishment. So you could, no, but I mean, this is a serious question. I mean, look, if we're thinking about the optimization of social structures, we might as well start from the base level of social structure and scaffold up.
Sure. So right? Like if a wife is upset at a husband, for instance, would that be considered use of force? I think a negative punishment. You're removing a stimulus to punish a person for something. Yeah, would you consider that like a use of force? Or
I would say it would depend to some degree on the intent.
The intent is to punish a behavior,
well, if the intent is to punish, then it's starting to move into the domain of force. I mean, look, while we've been talking, there's been bursts of emotion, right?
Yeah.
And that's because we're freeing entropy and trying to close and to enclose it again. And so that's going to produces negative emotion fundamentally, most fundamentally anxiety and pain, and secondarily something like anger, because those emotions are quite tightly linked.
Sure.
And so within the confines of a marriage, because we might as well make it concrete, there are going to be times when disagreements result in bursts of emotion. And those bursts of emotion don't necessarily have to have an instrumental quality, right? It's when the emotion is used manipulatively to gain an advantage that's short-term for the person, and then maybe that's at the expense of the other person, or even at the expense of the person who benefits future self. Then it starts to tilt into the manipulative. There's a tetrad of traits. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, that's manipulativeness. Narcissism is the desire for unearned social status. That's what you'd gain, for example, if you were gossiping and elevating your social status. Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, that's predatory parasitism, and those culminate in sadism. And that cloud of negative emotion that's released in the aftermath of disagreement can be tilted in the direction of those traits. And that's when it becomes malevolent. And that's when the problem of force starts to become paramount, because I think that your fundamental presupposition was both Hobbesian and ill-formed. I do not believe that the basis for the civilized polity is force. Now, you're saying that, you can't abjure the use of force entirely. And I would say, unfortunately, that's true.
I would agree with you.
But if the policy isn't invitational, if I can't make a case that's powerful enough for you to go there voluntarily, then the policy is flawed. Now, it may be that we have some cases where we can't do better than a flawed policy because we're not smart enough. And maybe the incarceration of criminals with a long-term history of violent offenses is a good example of that. We don't know how to invite those people to play. They have a history, generally from the time they're very young children, from the age of 2, of not being able to play well with others. And it's a very, very intractable problem. There's no evidence in the social science literature at all that hyper-aggressive boys by the age of 4 can ever be socialized in the course of their life. The penological evidence suggests that if you have multiple offenders, your best bet is to keep them in prison till they're 30. And the reason for that is it might be delayed maturation, biologically speaking, but most criminals start to burn out at around 27. So it spikes, it's a big spike when puberty hits, and then stability among the hyper-aggressive types. So actually what happens is the aggressives at 4 tend to be aggressive their whole life, and then they decline after 27. The normal boys are not aggressive. They spike at puberty and go back down to baseline, right? And so you don't really rehabilitate people in prison for obvious reasons. I mean, look at the bloody places. They're great schools for crime in large, but if you keep them there until they're old enough, they tend to mature out of that, except the worst of them tend to mature out of that predatory, short-term oriented lifestyle. So, and that's the force issue.
I agree. So fundamentally, to clear my stance up, I agree that fundamentally you're not building society on force. If for no other reason, because there'd be so much friction, it would fly apart at the seams, right? You can't force.
You get resistance if you use force.
Fundamentally, we're building off of cooperation. You want to invite people to participate in society. I agree with that. I feel like once you start to hit certain thresholds or certain points, and you've got so many different types of people involved, at some point we're going to have force around the edges on the guardrails just to make sure that we don't allow. Are you familiar with like tit for tat systems? Essentially? Yeah, tit for tat is probably a really important part of our evolutionary biological history and an important part of the animal kingdom. And I think to some degree that tit for tat punishment is important.
Is that force or justice?
You can call it what it is.
No. I'm curious what you think. This is a very serious question.
Yeah.
Because the tit for tat is very bounded, right? It's like, you cheat, I whack you, and then I cooperate, right?
Yeah.
So, and I do think that there's a model there for what we actually conceptualize as justice.
Sure.
It's like you don't get away with it, but the goal is the reestablishment of the cooperative endeavor as fast as possible.
Of course, I agree. But in a reductionist way, we're kind of just using justice here as a stand-in for force, right?
Well,
because a tit for tat system.
That's a good.
So there are different types of tit for tat systems, right? You've got tit for tat, you've got tit for tat tat, there's all sorts of type systems where maybe you'll let somebody make a mistake 1 or 2 times, but you can't have a tit system because then somebody can come in and take advantage of it.
Yes, which is the problem with the compassionate left, by the way.
To some extent, sure, it can be. Or a problem with the right that's far too forgiving of Donald Trump. But I would say that tat part, you can call it justice. I think justice is a perspective of force, right? Where some people might consider a force to be just, the cop that arrests the murderer, and other people might consider that force, that tat, to actually be injustice because the murderer was responding to environmental conditions, blah, 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 or was penitential or whatever.
That's a stupid theory, that responding to environmental conditions theory. Because here's why it's not.
Because essentially that's Rittenhouse's self-defense is responding with violence.
So if you assume that there's a causal pathway from early childhood abuse to criminality, let's say, which is the test case for environmental determination of the proclivity for the exploitation of others, then it spreads near exponentially in populations. That isn't what happens. So here's the data. Most people who abused their children were abused as children. But most people who are abused as children do not abuse their children. And the reason for that is because if you were abused, there's 2 lessons you can learn from that. One is identify with the abuser. The other is right, exactly. And what happens, and if this didn't happen, every single family would be abusive to the core very rapidly.
Yeah.
What happens is the proclivity for violence itself, it dampens itself out as a consequence of intergenerational transmission. So the notion that privation is a pathway to criminality, that's not a well-founded formulation. And there are an infinite number of counterexamples, and they're crucial. Some of the best people I know, and I mean that literally, are people who had childhood so absolutely abysmal that virtually anything they would have done in consequence could have been justified. And they chose not to turn into the predators of others. And that was a choice, and often one that caused them to reevaluate themselves right down to the bottom of their soul. And so that casual association of relative poverty, even with criminality, we know this too. You take a neighborhood where there's relative poverty, the young men get violent. They don't get violent because they're all hurt and they're victims. They get violent because they use violence to seek social status. And so even in that situation, it's not, oh, the poor. It's no wonder they're criminal because they need bread. It's like, sorry, buddy, that's not how it works. The hungry women feeding their children don't become criminals. The extraordinarily ambitious young men who feel it's unfair that their pathway to success become violent. And that's 100% well documented, and generally by radically left-leaning scholars.
Sure,
So,
I don't disagree with any of that. Wealth inequality in areas is a much better predictor of crime than poverty, than absolute
right, but
poverty.
it's a very specific form of crime. It's
sure.
status-seeking crime by young men. Right? Well, but that shows you what the underlying motive is. It's not even redress of the economic inequality. It's actually the men striving to become sexually attractive by gaining position in the dominance hierarchy.
Well, I think you have to be really careful with that assessment, though, because you can say that it's not economically. It's not seeking economic.
Why do you have to be careful? The biggest predictor of male.
Because we're assuming that people that commit crime in these types of circumstances are status seeking and not trying to seek economic remedy. But
That's
it might
exactly
be
what we're assuming.
But it might be the case, for instance, that in economically prosperous areas, that the men there aren't actually seeking economic prosperity. They're also just trying to elevate status, but they do it through economic prosperity. It's potential, right?
They do it with a longer term vision in mind.
Sure,
they're trying to elevate. I wouldn't disagree with that in the least.
Sure.
But they do it with a much longer time horizon in mind. And we know this partly because there have been detailed studies of gang members, for example, in Chicago, who are trying to ratchet themselves up the economic ladder, but they do it with a short-term orientation. Most of them think they're going to be dead by their early 20s.
Sure.
So they're trying to maximize short-term gain. So it has nothing to do with the redress of economic inequality, except in the most fundamental sense. And it is status-driven because they're looking for comparative status.
Sure, I understand what you're saying. I don't think any human being has baked in a desire to seek economic prosperity. I think that that's like a third order thing that we look for. And fundamentally, it's probably more like safety, security for ourselves, and then status seeking for other things.
I think that changes when you have children.
No, well, I mean, the safety and
Because
security
your
would extend to your
status is
children.
irrelevant or starts to become irrelevant at that point.
I mean, depending on how you view your status, right?
You can't do that every time we have a discussion.
Sure. Well, I'm just saying, for instance, one of the important things for my child is to be able to send my child to a good school. I need to have an elevated status, right? I need to be able to buy a house in the right school district, or I need to be able to pay the education for him
Right,
to
but
go.
you're not telling me, I hope, that the driving factor behind your desire to care for your children is an elevation in your status.
No, but I'm saying that the elevation of status might be what allows you to take care of children. So, for instance, one of the biggest predictors of getting married is already
it status
achieving
or position?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying
I know
all of these things kind of
confounding.
play into, yeah.
Okay, look, we're running out of time.
Yeah, you're good.
You're
Okay,
smart.
wait, real
You're
quick. Yeah,
smart.
just go back.
You're
I want to
sharp.
say that tit for tat thing. I was just saying that the tat thing, there is some underlying built into probably our genes, right? Because we see it all throughout the animal kingdom that there's some level of punishment or some level of force. You can call it justice.
No,
sure.
but I think it's the right.
It's
I really
justice
think
when you're the tatter, not when you're the titter, though, right?
No,
when you're the titter,
no,
it's just retribution.
No, I don't think that's true either. Look, if you read Crime and Punishment, for example, one of the things you see that emerges when Raskolnikov gets away with murder, and it's a brutal murder, and he gets away with it. It's completely clear, and he has a justification for it. And what happens as a consequence is that disturbs his own relationship with himself so profoundly that he can't stand it, such that when a just punishment is finally meted out to him, it's a relief. And that's not rare. And that is, like, there isn't anything more terrifying. This is why Crime and Punishment is such a great novel. There isn't anything more terrifying than breaking a moral rule that you thought you had the ability to break and finding out that you're somewhere now that you really don't want to be. And then that, there's nothing worse in your own life than waiting for the other shoe to drop. If you've transgressed against a moral rule and now you're an outsider because of that, you live in no man's land. The fact that you have just retribution coming to you that can be a precondition for your atonement and your integration back
True.
into society.
But it's probably important to note that depending on the system you exist in, those moral transgressions just aren't, right? So to take it back to, I'll use your leftist example, you might consider threat of force for somebody to get a vaccine to be a highly immoral thing that might be a transgression against some fundamental moral thing, but a person on the left might think that they're actually satisfying their moral requirement to society by doing so. Much the same as a child soldier, or not, I won't use child soldier, but maybe an older person that's committing intifada or some kind of Islamic terrorist thinks that they're fulfilling some moral calling as well.
No doubt that that's the case. That's why I was focusing in on the use of force, is that I think it's a good rule of thumb policy that if you have to implement your goddamn scheme with force, then there's something wrong with the way it's formulated.
Does it bother you that every religious...
We could have used a pure invitational strategy to distribute the vaccine. It would have been much more effective. And it was bad policy, rushed. We're in an emergency. We have to use force. It's like, no, you weren't. It wasn't the kind of emergency that justified force, not least because behavioral psychologists have known for decades that force is actually not a very effective motivator. It produces a vicious kickback. So, one of the things, this is going to happen for sure, is that the net deaths from people stopping using valid vaccines as a consequence of general skepticism about vaccination is going to cause, in my estimation, over any reasonable amount of time, far more deaths than COVID itself caused. You violate people's trust in the public health system at your great peril. And you do that by using force. And we did that. And so you can see already that there's hordes of people who are vaccine skeptic, this generalized skepticism that to some degree you were rightly decrying. It spreads like wildfire, and no wonder, because if you make me do something, I'm going to be a little skeptical of you for a long time.